uh, to invite Professor Mitja Durnik to have a speech for us. He is an assistant professor in the Faculty of the Public Administration, University of Ljubljana. He teaches the course such as the public policy analysis, comparative politicals, and EU politics, and the development of the public administration. His research is focused on the development theories, young policies, and political theories, and also include the crisis management. He has participated in numerous of the national and international projects and journals. He is currently writing a book in the field of the public policy titled Crisis Management of Public Policies in Times of the Global Changes. As several other foreign universities, he as visiting researchers includes the York University in the Toronto. And he is also participating in the RECAS International Conference in the field of the cross-border cooperation, political science, and crisis management. Today's seminar topic is China and the World Bank development approach in the Africa between the informal institutions and the JIC legalism. This research is linked with developed for the professor and his PhD candidate Dominic Wukushuki, right? So let's begin and move to the Professor Durnik. If you have any questions, you can free to ask. Thank you.
So thanks Haisheng for great presentation. So today I will represent one very important and pretty new topic in terms of studying development modes, development issues, development types in the African continent. So here we deal with two different approaches to development overall speaking, and specifically focusing to the African continent, to the African region in this sense. So in fact, first of all, we try on the theoretical level to find a kind of a joint, let's say, integrative approach, joining together World Bank, liberal, good governance approach on one hand. On the other hand, the so-called Chinese relational approach to development in foreign policy, in trade issues, in international relations, and so on. So it's quite new and pretty much unique, let's say still experiment, because this is still work in progress, how we can combine and how we can, in fact, integrate two completely different development approaches. The first one, that of liberalism, neoliberalism of World Bank. On the other hand, relational approach of China. So some basic information about this work in progress. I collaborate with my PhD student, where I'm co-supervisor, Dominic Vukušić, employed by the World Bank, and Dominic is also a PhD candidate in our joint program with the University of RECAS called Public Economics and Governance. So what are in fact important differences between Chinese relational approach and World Bank neoliberal liberal model of governance associated also with so-called good governance? So Chinese relational approach is quite, let's say, quite radically different than Western approach, liberal approach to development. But why? Because China, in fact, built relations with different, not just African states, but a lot of other states in the context of Belt and Road Initiative, in fact, let's say, put a significant attention on the so-called informal relation. This is one point. On the other hand, World Bank is typically different in implementing good governance principles and so on. So let's say on the side of the World Bank, or World Bank in fact advocates strong regulatory principles, rule of law, defending democratic issues, democratic principles, and so on. So Chinese approach, as I said, is a little bit different. But why? Chinese government decided to collaborate, let's say, quite new type of collaboration with states inside BRI initiative and wider, of course. In some sense, let's say, carrying out relations which are more informal, which are more softer, which are not so legalistic in one point of view. So the so-called Chinese relationism has its roots in Confucian religion and history in China, where informal relations, network of relations are important parameters in this sense. So let's say on one side, Chinese relational approach is more oriented to show informal relations, less legalistic approach, and so on. So as many political theorists, economists in China usually say, Chinese relationism is a kind of a alternative to the Western liberal approach. But of course, liberal approach, as I said, is more formal, is more legalistic on one side. On the other hand, the relational approach is less formal, is closer if we try to adapt it or compare with the Western political thought, is closer maybe to constructivism in one sense, to actor network theory and so on. So relational approach usually shape informal relations and imagine them as a kind of a relational network in this sense. Of course, in some sense, also in the context of modern liberalism and good governance and relational approach, power is certainly an important phenomenon, but probably not so much a central one. If we follow some, let's say, political realists in international relations like John Mersheimer or Stephen Walt, political realists usually say that power is at the center of understanding how states, how international organizations operate in international organizations. So relationism or Chinese relationism and liberalism in this sense, or liberal institutionalism, in fact, or theorists on these two fields usually say that not just power, but also democratic relations, moral questions, duties, and so on are important parameters in understanding those type of relations. So power is, of course, important, but not always crucial in the eyes of relationists and liberal scholars in this sense. So how do Chinese principles in international trade and international relations differ from those in Western countries? As I said before, in the West, in the eyes of Western liberal scholars, the rule of law is important. The power of regulation is important. So this has been seen also in the approach of the World Bank in inside different development programs in Africa and wider. So China advocates more informal relations with other countries, with not so much contracts, formal agreements, and so on. In this sense, China has a kind of advantage because all those procedures are not so much bureaucratic, are not so determined with so much rules and so on and so on. So we could call Chinese relationism as a kind of a partnership relationship approach on one hand, and strong regulatory framework on the side of the World Bank. So regulatory principles are pretty much very important in the operation of any, let's say, international organizations. So if we follow Wang works, for example, what is relationism? What is Chinese relationism? It's a variety of means, most of which are rather abstract and even ambiguous, with the view to building confidence and developing good relations through volunteer cooperation and non-binding promises. Very simply saying, without strong rules, so collaboration without strong rules based on informal agreements, let's say memory of understanding agreements, and so on and so on. And as we have seen in the past, a lot of agreements built upon Belt and Road Initiative as a main framework, a development framework where China collaborates with different countries, also with the African continent. So here we can see that China, in fact, seriously carries out less formal approach to do business in international trade relations. So what is then relational governance? Is the opposite, let's say, meaning to good governance. So relational governance, specifically in the Chinese context, is a process of negotiating social political arrangements that manage complex relationships in a community, country, international, or even globalized world. So, in fact, relational governance mainly comes from the relational theory in international relations, mainly invented by Qin, if I pronounced correctly. So Qin wrote about relationism in international relations theory, comparing also to liberalism, to realism, and, as I mentioned before, also to constructivism. Maybe a relational approach is more or less very common to some standpoints in constructivist point of view. If you follow, for example, very famous professor of Chinese culture and philosophy, Jana Roschker from Ljubljana University, we can say that Chinese relationism could be a kind of alternative of future globalized ethical relations. Simply saying, can we understand, using relationalist lenses, can we understand, let's say, joint integration of Western political thought, liberalism, also realism, with that of political thought in the East, like relational approach and any other similar approaches? Of course, we try to understand, we try to explain relational governance, relational ethics as a kind of a new understanding of Chinese investment experiment, in the African continent. We tried, to invent, let's say, a kind of a new political-economic phrase called the new political economy of relationism. Why? Because we try to show that not only Western liberalism, Western liberal thought is a possible explanation of development modes in Africa, but also a relational approach in combination with liberal political and economic thought, where we try to explain different types, different modes of development in Africa. Of course, they can be more or less harsh critiques of a relational approach, of a neoliberal approach of the World Bank in Africa. But of course, it's quite complex question, and this hybrid approach or holistic approach is still in the operational phase, and we cannot say that we seriously invented on the theoretical level something completely new. But in fact, we just simply saying we just try to join, to integrate two opposite and in fact two completely radically different political, economic, and also in some sense philosophical approaches to development. Finally, if you follow Roschker's work, this can be, of course, relationism could be a kind of a transcultural hermeneutical approach, of course, as I said before, to bridge the epistemological gaps between Eastern and Western political traditions. So it's still an experiment on the theoretical level, but we believe that we can bring something new, first of all, on the theoretical point of view, and secondly, also to the empirical, economic, and political analysis. So what about the approach of the World Bank? There are a lot of critiques, there are a lot of positive arguments, and so on. So, first of all, World Bank, in fact, transferred from the so-called structural adjustment programs approach in the 1990s, 2000, to a focus on good governance. So good governance is pretty new, innovative principle how we can understand the operation of public administration structures, international organizations, and so on. We know that we have several principles of operation, from democratic framework to the respect of human rights, democratic governance, collaboration among or between different policy actors in any let's say democratic modern point of view. But of course, good governance is only one of many modern governance models inside studying public administration, public policy, and so on. In fact, when we use the phrase or the transition from conventional Westminster type of government to governance, the fact is that modern management of public policies in plural is pretty much complex. We can speak about complex systems in public policy, about focusing events, punctuated equilibrium models, and so on, multiple streams framework, and so on and so on. So modern public policy, international relations, all these disciplines usually try to describe and shape modern world using lenses of complex systems, chaotic environments, relationship between external environments and internal structures, and so on and so on. So, in fact, modern public policy making is a complex one. We try to involve different vectors and so on and so on. Second thing, if you follow very famous scholar, political scientist, public administration scholar, also partial economist, Francis Fukuyama, who wrote a famous book, The End of History, then World Bank as such also follows the so-called advocacy of liberal institutionalism. Here, the role of international institutions in the liberal context is a prominent one. So, combination of institutionalism, freedom of speech, democratic relations, and so on and so on. So, liberal institutionalism and liberalism as such is, of course, in international relations theory, a complete opposite theory or approach to political realism, political realism with power, with only superficial role of superpowers, and so on and so on. So liberal institutionalism, in fact, defends, in some sense, the role of home institutions, international institutions, and involve in some way also modern approaches inside institutional theory as such. Then inside, let's say, a liberal context of the World Bank, of course, market-based solutions are crucial, with, of course, strong institutional arrangement, institutional framework, and, of course, in some sense, state intervention. Some political economists who criticized the operation of the World Bank usually say that it's too much defense of the private interest inside development models, not only in Africa, but of course wider, also East Asia, and so on. So one of the important critiques of the World Bank is also Professor Joseph Stiglitz, for example. Of course, in some parts, Stiglitz defended liberal values, institutionalism, and so on and so on, but he let's say, offered some important critique of neoliberal or several neoliberal reforms inside World Bank, of course. But also scholars who usually defend the operation of the World Bank in developing areas. You can find also some theoretical differences among them. Some of them are more oriented to more neoliberal explanation of investments, of policy intervention. On the other hand, some of them are more, let's say, socially oriented regarding to World Bank intervention in the international space. What about good governance in the context of the World Bank? Crucially, it is, as a concept, it is crucially, of course, connected with the, let's say, Western explanation of liberalism in politics, in political economy, in economic theory, and so on and so on. So it was introduced, let's say, introduced or invented at the end of 80s or at the beginning of 90s. So one very, very early definition is the following. What is good governance? It's the manner in which power is exercised in the management of a country's economic and social resources and development. And from this point, And from the beginning of 90s, good governance, sorry, became or has become one of the crucial concepts inside the World Bank policy documents and so on and so on. We have also different governance indicators measuring good governance in a lot of countries, more than 200, for example. Of course, we can find different varieties of governance indicators, not just inside World Bank database, but also in OECD data platform and so on and so on. So the governance agenda of the World Bank has changed over time a lot. So we would say from narrow technical reforms to broader institutional and political engagement. Of course, also in the last period, focusing to involve a variety of different policy actors. It was World Bank focused more and more efforts into the strengthening the relationship between decision makers and the public in affected countries, let's say in the African continent. So more and more, the involvement of the public is becoming important in terms of modern, let's say, complex policy making and decision making in this sense. Okay, let's go on. So here we can notice, we can see the evolution of the World Bank's thinking on governance. So at the very beginning, we can speak about initial engagement with governance. So very beginning, early theories of governance, why it is important to transfer our political and economic thought from conventional government to, let's say, modern governance. At the beginning of 90s, in 1991, World Bank, let's say, constructed a formal policy statement regarding to good governance. Then a few years later, it was an experiment focusing on addressing corruption. Corruption is still a very important research phenomena when we speak about potential development within the African continent, because we know these are still quite young states originated from 1960s, 1970s, when officially colonialism was ended in the African continent and so on and so on. So it's still, Western scholars still have some problems of perception how we can imagine development modes, development processes in the African continent, because still these are, as I said, younger states with the impact of local tribes and so on. So sometimes it's very tough, it's very complex to introduce some, let's say, Western principles of liberalism and put them and transfer them into local societies in those African states. In the last decade or so, I would say that the World Bank even strengthened the potential of good governance as a theoretical concept, using principles of good governance in introducing new political and economic reforms in the African continent. Okay, let's go on. So we are still here at the very theoretical level. So what are crucial differences between relationism and liberalism, just using theoretical lenses. So relationism, of course, specifically pointing out the Chinese aspect, we usually speak about the role of individuals and the so-called network of relations. So informality of relations is a crucial thing when we try to understand the so-called Chinese approach. We have still problems to perceive, to correctly imagine the Chinese culture, the Chinese political culture, the Chinese history. Supposed to be very, very different to the Western liberal political thought. So inside the Chinese approach, we try to point out the role of hierarchy, the role of harmony, the role of familiar relations within the modern Chinese society. But the fact is that the contemporary Chinese government tries to use those principles of relationism also in foreign relations, building strong, let's say, harmony relationships with different states. So morality is also very important in the Chinese culture. Of course, a kind of advocacy of collective stability, not just in China, but also in collaborating states. On the other hand, Western liberalism usually defend, let's say, postmodern individual in a sense that it is completely independent from the environment, from other individuals within modern societies, and so on. Then liberalism, in fact, or liberal scholars usually says that regulations are very important in international trade, rule of law, democratic relations, and so on and so on. In some sense, neoliberal approach usually defend the so-called minimal state. Here, if you remember, it was invented a new public management approach in the past, where somewhere it was successful, somewhere not, like in the question of, in the cases of Reaganomics in the United Kingdom, in the US, sorry, and Thatcherism in the UK. So I would say here it's a kind of a quite also important ideological clash in the West between more social approach to governance, like Scandinavian model or European welfare model. On the other hand, a more neoliberal approach supposed to be practiced in the US political and economic environment. So what about the role of China and the World Bank in Africa? So as I said, China has practiced much more informal approach, collaborating with African countries. Of course, World Bank is more oriented to advocate expert-driven conditional approach with a strong rule of law and strong regulation principles. But of course, here both parties involved, let's say, have some joint interest, right? Growth in those countries, stability, and conflict avoidance. Because when you try to implement new development strategies in those countries, in fact, stability, peaceful relations among different political groups, these are pretty much necessary conditions when you try to implement different development reforms. So a positive side of Chinese intervention is, of course, less bureaucratic, less bureaucracy approach from the Chinese side. On the other hand, World Bank is more oriented to defend stronger regulations, a rule of law, formal contracts, and so on. We explained more or less key differences between those two approaches. Again, I can repeat. So Chinese government usually prefer more informal relations, kind of a memory of understandings agreement, more than seriously strict legalistic approach. On the other hand, World Bank is more focused to build cooperation using formal arrangements, formal contracting, and so on and so on. Due to less formal approach by the Chinese side, China is often more successful in introducing development strategies, investments in the African region. But of course, World Bank has had stronger and more prominent history in supporting the development of different African states. So we don't have a lot of time, so we have to hurry a little bit. I will show two graphs. The first one is World Bank investment in Africa. So here we can see that in the last year, the more and more investments, or the World Bank invested a lot of financial resources, specifically to Nigeria, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Egypt. On the other hand, Chinese investments in Africa, we can notice on this graph that a lot more than other countries, Angola received quite a lot of funding from China. I have to point out that those calculations are done by my colleague Dominic, as I mentioned before. So here some data are from World Bank database. This graph was made using Boston University Global Development Policy database. But as I mentioned before, this work is still in progress, because we write a paper together using the theoretical framework, but also in the next stages we will make stronger political economic analysis in this field. So the problem with collaboration between World Bank and China is that there are not a lot of initiatives that bring together these two approaches. Broadly speaking, one initiative is more broader, is the so-called World Bank and Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank joint initiative. So the fact is that maybe we could reach better positive arrangements if we in the future, if World Bank World Bank and China could collaborate stronger in the field of development in Africa. Why? Because China, in some sense, can offer a less bureaucratic approach, more focused on growth, on informal relations on one hand. On the other hand, World Bank can still support the rule of law, formal contract agreements, democratic issues, and so on in those countries. The fact is that many of African countries are still more or less authoritarian in their nature. And of course, maybe the perception of, let's say, modern authoritarianism is different in China and in the West. I cannot be very negative towards different political systems, but of course, more than ideological framework, I would say, it is more important to offer African states a stable political-economic environment to support development in those countries. So I would say that even this is not still a reality. An integrated approach using relationism and liberalism as such could be a kind of a new solution, let's say innovative policy solution in supporting, let's say, African economies. I will here, at this point, in a very short manner, represent the so-called Tazara project, which is a long-term project of building a railway between Tanzania and Zambia. It started, or the agreement was signed in September 1967. So let's say a lot, 50 years, not 50, 60 years, approximately 60 years ago. And at the beginning, it was a story, of course, a realistic story that Western countries and also World Bank did not support the initiative to build new railway project during this time in Africa. And then the Chinese president, Mao Zedong, decided to support the project. But of course, we can understand the Chinese mode of development and foreign policy strategy in the past, where China always tried to support projects where natural resources are crucial in this context. Also today, China, as an intensively developing world economy, tries to find different territories in Africa, specifically rich with natural resources. Okay, then in 1967, the so-called Tanzania-Zambia Railway Authority was established. It is still exists today. Construction began in 1970s. So the project was formally announced and initiated with former very famous presidents in fact, of Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda, and the president, of Zambia, yes, and President Julius Nyerere of Tanzania. We have to have in mind that Zambia and Tanzania in the 60s, 70s became an important part of the so-called independent movement of the countries, where also former Yugoslavia was one of the initiators. President Tito at that time with Indian President Jawaharlal Nehru and President of Egypt at that time. This movement of independent countries was the second most important international organization, let's say, in the world, besides the United Nations. So contemporary improvements, this is very interesting now. So China decided, I think this year, 3 months ago, that it will continue to support the reconstruction, the revitalization of Tanzania-Zambia railway. it's supposed to be very important, specifically, as I said, in terms of extracting natural resources. So I would say that China, we should understand also this last improvements, last developments, contemporary developments in a wider scheme of Belt and Road Initiative, specifically in the global context and in the African continent. So China sees also this project as an important part of Belt and Road Initiative. And I would say we have formal projects, Chinese development projects, which are formally part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Some of them are more informal part, but all of them we can try to understand in a wider context of BRI initiative. So what about the World Bank? World Bank is not directly involved in Tazara project, but in 2024, the World Bank announced the approval of $200 million in funding for the second phase of the Tanzania intermodal rail development project. So in some sense, this can be understood as a kind of indirect involvement of World Bank in the Tazara wider project. So here we can understand relationism and liberal approach of both partners, how they complement each other, in fact. So let's say Chinese financing and technical support contribute to improving World Bank approach can contribute to the Chinese investments in terms of improving regional rail connectivity and efficiency. As I said at the very beginning, so probably the joint integrated, let's say even holistic approach could be a kind of a potential new solution in this sense. So in 3 minutes, these are some, of course, partial conclusions. As I said before, this is still this is still work in progress, and we will do more serious economic and political analysis in the near future. So what about holism? So we can see some advantages of integration in joint planning of development, joint financing, and of course, joint risk sharing of both parties, of both partners. As I said, these are two different approaches to development, but in some sense could be integrated in the one new or reconstructed holistic solutions. So less administrative burdens in the Chinese context, where Chinese government usually provoke quicker development of projects and so on because of less bureaucracy, less formalized relations among parties involved and so on. Of course, there can appear some possible conflicts, like different strategic environments, different strategic environments, let's say metaphorically speaking, between East and West. Then how both parties interpret law requirements, formal agreements, and so on and so on. Institutional differences in project implementations and so on. What about future collaboration? It is possible to intensify joint initiatives. Of course, the success of such a model depends on political will, geostrategic environments, relations. If I use a realistic approach in international relations, it is always crucial to respect the will of the superpower, or two, let's say approximately two superpowers in today's context. So this was my presentation. As I said, this is still work in progress. We should do much more effort to first of all to to offer wider and deeper theoretical explanations of these two radically different approaches, and then also deeper and more serious economic analysis of these different development modes in the African continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much for Professor Durnik's presentation. Uh, let's move next to process. Do you have any questions?
I would have some questions.
Okay,
Is that
please.
okay? Yes? Okay,
Yes.
great. Thanks, Mitja, for your presentation. I had a few comments and, especially based on my experience working with development banks. So I wanted to first, methodologically speaking, just wanted to ask you, I mean, here you're putting a country, which is China, comparing with a multilateral bank, which is the World Bank, which I think in itself methodologically might be causing some issues because it's simply different because the country is much more sovereign in their decision and how they allocate their funding differently from the World Bank. So maybe my question here is, would it make more sense to compare Asian Development Bank with World Bank? So that's one of the comments I had. And then I was wondering why would you say your theoretical framework, I mean, is applicable to other regions, or you really want to focus only on Africa or developing countries more broadly? So I think here it is also important to be clear on that, whether this will travel and will be applicable to other regions as well. Then there was another dichotomy which I wanted to ask you about. On the one hand, you associated World Bank with rule of law more and this approach, and on the other hand, a moral and ethical approach by China. But then for me, rule of law is actually codifying ethical behavior. So it's about respecting international conventions, labor laws, procurement laws, protecting the environment in many cases. So I just wanted to understand whether this is really a dichotomy, or we can maybe argue with that. And in terms of relationalism, I was wondering, because I would maybe suggest to look a bit also in this intricate difference pre and post signing an agreement or a loan, because in my experience, everybody is relational before something is signed. I've worked in government before, so any bank, whether that's World Bank, EBRD, everybody is very relational, try to convince you, be your friend, that they're the best position to work on this project, etc. So they try to maintain these relations from the most top level to advisors to everybody in the public administration. But then things change a bit in the implementation phase. So in the implementation phase, this let's say Western banks, they are much more stringent in their rules and expectations, and maybe with China is a bit more relaxed, this relation. But I've also had experience where there is a loan signed with China and then you cannot reach to the people in the Exim Bank, for instance. So this relationalism, I think it's good to be explored in these two stages, pre and post signing of the agreement. And finally, one experience working a bit in Central Asia, for instance, I see actually Asian Development Bank, World Bank actually collaborating very well on projects. So to me, it seems that an important dimension would be also to look into the government that is taking these loans and what kind of approach they have, because sometimes they put them in a position to collaborate, and all of these banks, of course, they're, besides ideological issues, they also want their loans to be repaid. So this is also something that drives them, and this also shapes their approach. So these are a few notes I took while you were speaking, but I find it very, very good research. I'll stop here for now.
Thank you very much. So a lot of questions. Maybe I will start with the methodological issues. So I also teach comparative politics. So it is always a question. If we compare very similar issues, or if we compare very different issues. And of course, as you said, also comparing Asian Infrastructure Bank and World Bank could be even more proper, I would think, in some sense. But I started also the analysis as a political scientist. So more or less, I'm trying to understand how sovereign state as China is, or superpower, how can collaborate with the World Bank structure in some sense. But of course, you always should involve in some sense the role of the Asian infrastructure bank in this sense. So this is maybe methodological point of view, or how we can understand comparison in some sense. So the second issue, if I understand correctly, the role of relationism in some sense. As I said before during the presentation, you have of course different corners of understanding of relational approach. That one which was presented during the lecture is more or less the Chinese context in this sense. But of course, in the Western philosophical, political, and economic thought, you can also find very similar issues explaining, let's say, informal relations, the so-called interpretation of social realities, and so on. For example, social constructivism, actor network theory, and many more, which are very, very similar to that Chinese relational approach, but maybe with different ideological backgrounds in some sense. But of course, all those approaches are more or less focused to the role of the individual within the society, how individuals are connected in the operation of the wider society and the state, and so on. Can you repeat the second part of your questions again, please? Maybe in a very short manner.
Yes, maybe a dichotomy, or at least to me it sounded as a dichotomy, this rule of law versus moral and ethical approach of China.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, I was asking about, actually, in some context, all of these sectors collaborate pretty well, especially multi-development banks.
Sure. Look, I mean, as I said before, understanding Chinese relationism is still pretty much complex. I would say if you want check additional literature, maybe some writings of Jana Roschker, professor of Chinese philosophy from the Faculty of Arts, the University of Ljubljana. So professor wrote a lot of interesting works regarding to conventional relationism, modern relationism within Chinese society, and so on. But of course, as such, it's quite complex philosophical tradition understanding relationism as such. So I applied only this, let's say, a political thought from international relations theory, where, for example, Professor Chin compared relationism with a liberal approach, constructivism, and political realism. And some scholars usually often say that the relational approach is not very common to understand. Let's say the China approach in the African development approach in the African continent, because somebody would say that it's too wide, maybe too interpretative in some sense, using methodological senses. But of course, the vision is still, when we develop those ideas on the theoretical level, how we can integrate a relational approach in terms of defending morality, duties, informal relations, less bureaucratic approach with that very, very strict, let's say, legalistic approach of the World Bank. But of course, as you said, this is very, very correct. Then we can understand relationism also in the operation of the World Bank. But of course, we can put some differences, show differences between Western explanation of relational approach and, of course, relationism within the Chinese political culture and history.
Yes, exactly. I think it would be very interesting to see how this relationalism actually differs across the two, because it's existing in both cases for sure.
Because this work, in fact, has two very broad contexts. One is theoretical, so we will publish probably several academic articles just improving and testing theoretical merging. On the other hand, of course, we will do some more serious economic analysis, but previously, of course, we would try to seriously make some clearance about possible integration of these two different approaches. And on the other hand, of course, as you said, maybe one analysis should be done also comparing World Bank and Asian infrastructural banks. So that is also very, very good suggestion from your side, maybe to advance our research progress and interest.
Yes, exactly. And that's why my question on the region, on the choice of Africa, because I think Central Asia would be very interesting in that regard, to compare Asian Development Bank and World Bank and others, I would say, here also. And you'll get a much more comprehensive overview. Or test what you find in Africa, then apply it here and see how it differs maybe.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks again for your valuable suggestions, and I will include some of them also in the future work.
Thank you. Do you have any other questions? Okay, I have one question. How do you think about in the future, China and the World Bank, they will become the more similar development strategy in the future? Why or not? Thank you.
I would think yes. For example, even sometimes I'm very critical towards the operation of the World Bank in the African continent. But I think that China will integrate its approach, let's say relational approach, into the wider geopolitical context of liberalism. I can imagine, I would imagine Chinese involvement into wider trade relations, geopolitical relations, political relations, in a sense that we can imagine one very big network of relations inside. A liberal approach, on the other hand, relational network could be integrated quite easily in some sense in globalized trade and geopolitical relation in this sense. So I would say that the future integration would be more or less quite easy, because the main joint interest of the World Bank and other Western states and China is more or less not so much political conflict, but economic collaboration, economic growth, economic development. And even we are witnesses to some quite radical Trumpism in international economic relations. But I believe that during maybe in the second part of this year, I believe pretty much that United States and China and wider international political environment will agree on lower tariffs, on more intensive economic collaboration and so on. Because one very important issue is here. This is appearing new models in the artificial intelligence field. And even different states build their own models, but artificial intelligence as a completely new policy field, in some sense, needs a strong collaboration of the West and eastern part of the globe. So I believe that, let's say, integration of the Chinese economic model into wider Western mode of operation will be soft, will be less conflictual, will be without any serious obstacles. That's my vision.
Thank you. I saw that Peter have some questions. Hi.
Yeah, sure. So I wanted to say, first of all, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. And I just wanted to ask, kind of switching around maybe the focus a bit, to ask about the actual kind of object of this development. So in other words, if we focus on, say, just this railway line, I mean, what are the different kind of understandings of China and the World Bank in relation to the, let's say, the developmental object of the railway project? So I mean, okay, I mean, I understand that, let's say, the procedural, if you want, or governance differences. But is there a difference in the way that the railway line is also understood between the World Bank and China?
Very good question. Thank you. This railway is very important also in the past, because it connects mining areas. So both territories in Tanzania and Zambia are rich of natural resources, diamonds, and so on. So pretty much, as I said before, when China supports those infrastructure projects, the most important economic and political issue is how China can find different new areas of natural resources, oil, diamonds, and so on. So natural resources are still at the heart of the Chinese interest. Of course, this is also an interest of Western countries, World Bank, but of course, they both partners differently support the economic development in those countries, infrastructure projects, and so on and so on. But of course, in reality, China needs more and more natural resources because of intensive economic growth, more and more jobs. So China is becoming a serious economic superpower besides, maybe the only one besides the United States of America.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. How about our time? Yeah, maybe our time is over. How do you think, Tina?
I think if there's no more questions, so we can slowly finish.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for Professor, and I'll thank you for all of your attendance. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you
Thank you.
very much.
Thank you for your participation. Thanks to Tina. Thanks to Haisheng, my former PhD candidate here at the University of Ljubljana and our PhD student at our joint program with the University of RECAS. So I believe that we will have fruitful collaboration, not only with WHO, but also with other partners at the University of RECAS in the near future. Thanks again for your invitation, and I'm very happy that I had a chance to present this important, let's say, political-economic issue and challenge in the African continent.
Thank you once again for your time.
Thank you.
To all next week.
Thank you. See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.